Bom dia para quem é de bom dia, boa noite para quem é da boa noite, boa tarde se você acabou de receber a notificação e veio assistir essa entrevista que está escrito ali, Perdurabo, a biografia do homem mais maléfico do mundo. E quem escreveu a biografia, considerada uma das melhores biografias do Crowley, vai estar aqui hoje no programa Richard Kaczinsky, que vai ser entrevistado. Mas antes, você vai precisar vir até aqui e no Legendas e colocar Translate to Portuguese. E aí você vai ter as legendas e vai entender o que a gente está falando. And now I will speak in English. Thank you so much to be with us in this interview, Richard. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
Well, the first question that we ask, because you're not known to the Brazilian audience, is that you introduce yourself. They only know that you wrote one of the best books, the biography of Aleister Crowley. But you have several other books that we'll talk about in the show. But first, I'd like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your journey. We usually like to watch, to ask our guests, because when you're young, you go to the church and everything, and then 30 years later, you're writing the biography of the weakest man in the world. How's that?
So I guess first, by way of introduction, I would say hello, my name is Richard Kaczinsky, and I have been studying Aleister Crowley and his writings since I was about 14 years old. And since then, I have become involved in Aleister Crowley's organization, Ordo Templi Orientis. I've written several books focusing on Aleister Crowley, including Perdurabo, The Life of Aleister Crowley, The Wiser Concise Guide to Aleister Crowley, also Panic in Detroit, The Magician and the Motor City. And I've also written a history of the early years of OTO up until the time Crowley got involved. And that book is called Forgotten Templars, The Untold Origins of Ordo Templi Orientis. Later this year, there will be published a new edition of Aleister Crowley's work, The Sword of Song, which I have edited and annotated with a lot of explanatory footnotes. And so that will be coming out this year. And so, I could go on, but that's, I think, a pretty good introduction. But in terms of how I got started, I in a way, it seems to me that was inevitable. When I was a child, I was raised Roman Catholic. So from a young age, I was used to seeing ritual. But in addition to that, when I was growing up, this is in the 1970s, it just seemed like metaphysical stuff and the unusual was just everywhere. Where there's Bigfoot, UFOs, ESP, psychic phenomenon, and all sorts of other weird, ghosts and unexplained things. It just, there were TV shows, there were movies, books, magazines. There was even a psychic game show that was on television. And so for me, it just kind of felt like, of course I turned out this way, but not everyone else, in my age group, my whole generation did not turn out the same as me. So there's obviously something else going on. But when I was 14 years old, I used to take my bicycle everywhere, and I found the local metaphysical occult bookshop. And the first book I got there was the complete prophecies of Nostradamus. And I thought that was really great. And I came back the next time, I got Israel Regardie's book, The Golden Dawn. So that was, a big jump from Nostradamus to The Golden Dawn. And when I came back, the owner asked me how I liked The Golden Dawn. And I said, oh, it was really great. I enjoyed that. And he said, if you like The Golden Dawn, you will like this book. And he pulled out Magic and Theory and Practice. I don't, to this day, I don't know what it was that bookstore owner saw something, recognized or saw something in me and took me under his wing. Would I have found Crowley without him? Eventually I suppose I would have, but he kind of put me on the express lane, on the highway, with Crowley. And 40 years later, I'm still going, but he got me reading Magic in Theory and Practice, and it made no sense at all. I did not understand what he was talking about or anything, but it was like a puzzle, and it got my curiosity going, and I wanted to figure it out. So I just started reading more and more until it started to make sense. I understood what he was talking about in that book. And in some ways, that was what my book, The Wise or Concise Guide to Aleister Crowley, was all about. It was, when the editor, Jim Wasserman, asked me to write this book, the mission statement he gave me was, write the book that we wish that we had when we were kids, to get us started. And so that's what I set out to do. And it's gotten good reviews, so I think I accomplished that.
And you have written several books, but they're mostly about Telemann Crowley. Do you work with that? What was your we say, the profane career?
Oh, well, I in my day job in the real world, my degree is in psychology, so I have a doctorate in social psychology. And as part of my doctoral research, I looked at the psychology of what I call metaphysical beliefs. In psychology, there isn't standard terms. Sometimes they're called paranormal beliefs or whatever. So I just, I wanted to kind of distance myself from some of the existing measures out there that I critiqued. So I picked a different word to set what I was doing apart. And my minor was in statistics. And when I graduated with my my doctorate in psychology, I found that there was more of a market for someone who could do statistics well than there was for someone who could do psychology well. So ever since then, I've been working in the field of biostatistics and research. I've taught medical students, I've taught nursing students, pharmacy students, and in the university and outside of the university, doing data analysis and publishing papers. So when Crowley talks about the method of science in the name of religion, I do the method of science all day long.
It's important because of the next question, because as a scientist and a Telemite, what's magic to you?
Well, I'll start first of all with Crowley's definition, which I imagine if you're listening to this, you've probably heard somewhere before. And Crowley says that magic is the science and art of causing change to occur in conformity with will. The trick is what is will, and I think if you want to try to avoid jargon, this whole idea of what is thelema, what is do what thou wilt should be the whole of the law, what does all that stuff mean? I would interpret that as basically saying that everything that we do, it's a philosophy that says everything that we do needs to be authentic to our true selves. And so that with the goal that we are striving to become the best possible version of ourselves. The trick with that is to find out who you really are deep down underneath. You've got to dig through all these layers of programming that we all experience from living in the real world. So there's, society tells us how we should see things and how we should think and what we should be. Our families, whether it be the things they teach us, or if you're from a terrible family, they're an example of what not to do. Advertising, religion, politics, all these things, are kind of filling our head with these expectations. And we need to kind of get around that to get to the core of who we are. And for me, I see magic as being the tools to clear all that stuff out of the way and to get to know yourself. Who are you? And it takes work and it takes discipline. But the great thing about it is that once you get to that answer, then you have that strength and that discipline to keep using to do your will, to be who you are meant to be in this world.
And we have talked a lot about the true will. Now, you've seen I've interviewed Don Milo and Aaron Leitch and several others who talked about the Abramelin and the ritual and the true will. And we had several other friends here asking me to ask you about if you have any experience with the Abramelin and finding your true will, and if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, I would not, I mean, I have done Abramelin and Abramelin type ritual work in my past. And I would say that is the Abramelin working and similar sorts of things are associated with something called the knowledge and conversation of your holy guardian angel. And that is not necessarily, at least in my mind, the same as discovering your true will. I think you can discover your true will and come to an understanding of yourself without necessarily, I mean, before you get to the Abramelin, I mean, you could still figure yourself out. The idea for me is that the Abramelin is kind of a connection to that higher spiritual authority. When Crowley writes that when you have attained the knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel, you don't need any other teachers. It's the Holy Guardian Angel will kind of direct and inform your journey from that point on. But I feel in some ways like I'm a bit of an aberration in Thelema, in that I kind of feel from very, very young age, I've had a very clear picture of what I wanted to do. I mean, I always knew I wanted to write. And I wrote short stories. I wrote a novel, when I was in 3rd grade, so I was like 8 years old, it's what you'd expect from an 8-year-old. It's time travel and dinosaurs and, that kind of stuff. But there's never a moment in my life that writing was not the goal. What I was going to write, that for me is the journey. And oftentimes I think about will and true will, is that thing that you just, if you take everything away, it's the thing that you just can't not do. It's the thing that you have to do. And for me, it's writing. It always has been. So I guess in that sense, I did kind of have that idea of where I was going, way before I even, contemplated doing the Abramelin work.
And talking about the Abramelin and true will and everything like that, we wouldn't be here talking if it wasn't for Aleister Crowley. So you wrote Perdurabo, that's a biography of him. So who was Aleister Crowley?
Aleister Crowley was a poet, philosopher, occultist, author, mountain climber, secret agent, man of mystery, in the first half of the 20th century. He's largely known today, in general, for Thelema, for saying, do what the will should be the whole of the law, and also for identifying himself with the great beast from Revelation. And both of those things are things that people generally don't really understand, or they misunderstand. And that's why you have these ideas that Crowley was, the wickedest man in the world and things like that. It's born more from not understanding. It's more ignorance than it is truth.
Yeah, I have interviewed a translator that wrote one biography of Crowley, and he said that when he was young, he saw a biography of Crowley that said that the man died at the age of 78, devastated by the drugs. And he thought and said, whoa, 78-year-old, I want to die 78-year-old devastated by the drugs. And then he said, maybe he's not this kind of evil. And he fell in love with Aleister Crowley and wrote this biography. So for you, what was the point that sparkled and said, I have to write the biography of Aleister Crowley?
It's kind of like what you just said, that I was familiar enough with Crowley that I was frustrated with reading these biographies that I were very sensationalistic. They just got him wrong. They focused on things that were, I don't know, not necessarily even true. They wanted, you know, they liked the rumors and the myths. They just wanted to tell a dirty story because that would sell books, but it wasn't an accurate story. And I just read, you know, one day I read a book that was, again, just like that. And another thing that bothered me was a lot of these books, you know, they wouldn't just tell you the story that, oh, Aleister Crowley, you know, did this and that, but it was very clear that they were trying to tell you what you should think, how you should feel, and say, isn't he a terrible man? Look at this stuff that he did. And I kind of thought, you know, I don't need you to tell me what to think of him, you know. And so those things all together made me want, you know, I was reading this. I remember I was reading this book on an airplane and just rolling my eyes, and I just said, I could do a better job than this. And, you know, again, I've always wanted to be a writer. You know, it's something I've been working at my whole life. And this voice in the back of my head said, why don't you? And so I did. And my goal was to stick to the facts and, you know, try to speak from a place of knowledge, because I felt like, having studied and worked Crowley's magic, I had an understanding of what magic was and what that meant to him. That and again, it's an insider kind of knowledge that someone from the outside just wouldn't get. But I also just wanted to keep my opinions to myself. I just wanted to say, here's the facts. You're reading this book, you're smart, you can figure out for yourself whether you think he's great or terrible or whatever. That's your business. My job is just to tell you the story. And I think, you know, whether you find Crowley to be, you know, great or the great beast, or you know, awful or whatever, the truth remains is that his life and his story is still fascinating. You know, you know, when you asked me who Crowley was, you know, I was just started rattling things off. You know, he by the time he was 30, he had published a 3-volume book of his poetry, his collected poems. He had written novels, books on magic. I mean, the Equinox, you know, 11 volumes of the Equinox. Most of that stuff was written by him. You know, he was just a prolific writer. He was a mountaineer. He set climbing records. He could play chess blindfolded and most of the time beat you. And there's just so many, he was, you know, a spy, you know, that's just, there's so many angles to his life. You know, any one of those would be an interesting life. And he lived like 7 or 8 lives all at the same time. And that to me is fascinating. Again, whether you like him or not, it's just a remarkable story, a remarkable person.
Yes. I have a question from Breno. I said, Crowley wrote a great amount of texts, libraries, and books through his life. So how to read it? Chronological, by class, by subject? For someone who does not know Crowley and wants to know a little bit better about their work, his work, how would you recommend?
That's kind of a tricky question. I mean, speaking again for me and my childhood experience, you know, when I guess I would say don't start with magical theory and practice, because that's where I started, and I didn't understand a lot of it. So there are probably better places than that. That said, you know, I do see a lot of people say, you know, book 4, you know, Liber Abba, which contains magic and theory and practice, as well as, you know, book 4, parts 1 and 2 on yoga and magic, are just kind of a great reference book. But for me, what I found was when I first started approaching Crowley, I think the thing that confused me and made it difficult was that Crowley it's like his work is like this big web. And in Magic and Theory and Practice, he's constantly referring to things that he wrote someplace else. And so then you got to go to that someplace else, and then that other someplace else. And sometimes the thing he's talking about wasn't even published yet, or it's not published at all. And for me, Crowley didn't really start making sense until I read several of his books and read all of the Equinox. And then when I went back, I could say, oh, I know what you're talking about there, because I remember reading that. But it's, but it's kind of hard to say, read everything by Crowley and then it will make sense, because, who's got, that's a lot of, it's an investment of a lot of time. So in some ways, it might be better to pick up something that's an introduction, something like the Wiser Concise Guide to Aleister Crowley, or Lon Milo Duquette's, the Magic of Aleister Crowley, or something like that, something that will kind of give you like a kind and gentle introduction and an overview. And then, you can pick up something heavy like Magic and Theory and Practice and dive in. At least, hopefully that will give you some sense of what it means.
Yeah, some say that Crowley wrote for the initiated. He wrote for someone who has been practicing for a long time. So if you're just beginning your studies, it will not make a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I think it depends on what you're reading, because certainly there are a lot of the Libri of Crowley was written for serious students of magic. Something like Liber Aleph, the Book of Wisdom or Folly, that was not written for the general public, and the general public would not figure that and understand that. But at the same time, he wrote, I think it's something like 8 lectures for yoga. That's a very simple and understandable, set of, it's a very understandable book, because it was a set of 8 lectures that he actually gave to the general public. And so, he could write and he could be comprehensible when he wanted to, but when he was writing for fellow magicians, then he laid it on thick with the symbolism and the correspondences and all of that. And it kind of requires that you're familiar with, your Kabbalah to really make sense of what he's talking about. And also familiar with his other writings, because again, it's all this big circle, and he cites this and then cites that, which cites this, and back over and around again.
We usually compare to that saying in Morpheus in the Matrix movie. He says, no one makes the first jump. So you have to read something and say, I didn't understand anything. And then you put it aside, study. 1 year, you pick up the same book and say, oh, now I know what it's doing here.
Yeah, and I don't mean to discourage anybody. For me, the fact that I didn't understand Magic and Theory and Practice when I was 14 years old, seeing it for the first time, that did not discourage me. It grabbed me. It was a puzzle that I wanted to figure out. And it's what you say, is about the books. When you come back to them, it's true. Again, Lon Milo Duquette, talks about how he would reread, the Book of Thoth. And it seemed like every time he went back and reread it, it was a different book, because he understood it from a different point in time in his life.
And even we had the sacred books of Telema, and every year I read something and I say, oh, this is new. I didn't get it last year. And
yeah, that's beautiful.
That's very beautiful. I have a question from Rodrigo. He said, you are a member of the OTO. Could you explain for us what is it and what's the benefit of joining such a group? And I would like to ask for our audience that what is the OTO?
All right. The OTO, or Ordo Templi Orientis, is it's an initiatory society. And what I mean by that is that when it's a group that you join and you go through a series of initiations, and each of the initiations are kind of like a magical or mystery play. they have occult meaning, but they also have practical meaning. And if, in OT, and again, any secret society is like that, but specifically in OTO, the rituals are designed to also, gradually give you instructions in what is the philosophy of Thelema and how to apply that to your life, how to live as a Thelemite. One thing I would say, just before we get into what someone might get out of being in OTO, I would also say that if you are thinking about joining OTO and taking these initiations, I would in the strongest words encourage you, don't go on the internet. Do not try to find initiations and read them ahead of time, because you're just ruining it for yourself. And that's it. You're not spoiling it for anyone but you, because what these rituals are designed to do, and then again, any initiation is like this, but it is designed to, to make you think. It's designed to surprise you, and it's designed to, I don't know, it puts you in this, a state of, psychological arousal, a kind of an altered state of consciousness in which you actually undergo transformation. And it may be temporary, but, that's the goal of this. And if you've read ahead, then you know what's coming, and you're not going to have that experience. I think of, the Greek philosopher, who was puzzling on a problem and solved it and was so excited that he jumped out of his bathtub and ran through the streets going, "Eureka, I have got it," without even bothering to put his clothes on, because he was so excited about having figured something out. And to me, that's kind of the heart of the initiation experience. You can have a problem and someone can tell you the solution, but that's not the same as figuring it out. And knowledge is not the same thing as enlightenment. So, just don't spoil it. If you're gonna do this, go in and be surprised. Have the experience that it was intended to give you, and get the most out of it. And so that is one thing that you would get out of joining a group like OTO. You would get these lessons and these rich experiences. And one thing that's nice about that is that it builds a sense of community, because your other brothers and sisters in OTO have gone through those experiences too. And so you have these shared things that bind you together and that you can talk about. And I think it's that sense of community that is probably the most valuable thing that you would get out of OTO. At least that's one of the things I found, is that, magic is largely a thing that we do for ourselves. Again, we're trying to become the best version of ourselves. And so that means a lot of the work that we do is done by ourselves. We do it at home. We do it in our home temples, or in our bedrooms, or our closets, or wherever, we're able to do, that work on the astral plane. It's all good. But when you get together with other people who share your interests, your enthusiasms, it recharges your batteries, and you get together and you talk about people who are all into the same thing. And then that makes you want to go home and do the work that much harder. And so it sustains what you're doing. And, the people involved, they can all teach classes or recommend books or lead rituals. And it's all just this very rich sort of experience. And I've had the luxury, or the benefit, I've been very lucky that in my time in OTO, I've been able to travel literally around the world, meeting brothers and sisters along the way. And, my favorite people in the world are my brothers and sisters in OTO. And these are people I never would have met if not for this organization. So I'm grateful, for the OTO introducing me to brothers and sisters, friends and loved ones that I wouldn't have met otherwise. But to that, I would like to tack on one other thing, and that is, I've always been kind of self-sufficient. The things I do, I mean, writing is kind of solitary. I love reading. I play piano, which is something you generally practice and you do by yourself. I telecommute. I work from home on the computer, so a lot of, I'm just kind of wired for being solitary. So and working Crowley's system by myself was working fine for me. And so what brought me to OTO was not, what is this going to do for me? What brought me to OTO was the idea that I think that Crowley, his magic, and this set of rituals that he specifically wrote is really cool. And I wanted to make that available to other people. And to give them that experience. So for me, it wasn't, what am I going to get out of this? It was more, and it always has been, and it still is, more a matter of, how can I help? What can I do to let other people who are interested get these experiences, and to see what Crowley's magic was really all about.
Great. I have a question now for Breno. He said you have written The Forgotten Templars as well. And what have changed in the order since then, and what hasn't changed? And first of all, what is The Forgotten Templars about?
Okay, that book is looking at how Ordo Templi Orientis came to be. Who are the founders? The Oriental Templars, or the Forgotten Templars I'm talking about, because the four founders, Karl Kellner, Theodor Reuss, Franz Hartmann, and Henry Klein, and particularly Henry Klein, just not a lot is known about them. And so I wanted to tell the story about who these people were and how, this world of esoteric Freemasonry gave birth to Ordo Templi Orientis. And that involved talking about things like, the Scottish Rite and craft Freemasonry and the Swedenborgian Rite and John Yarker's Ancient and Primitive Rites and all these other groups, the Rosicrucians and so on, all of which kind of fed into this soup, I guess. And Theodore Reuss kind of boiled it down. And after, he tried to run these organizations, but ultimately came to a point where it was easier to kind of do his own thing. He had these authorities in this organization. He said, let's just kind of simplify things. Memphis and Mizraim at like 90 and 95 degrees. And so that's impossible to work practically. And so OTO became this 9-degree reduced system. And Crowley came along. And so this is, I guess, the first place that it changed. And it was like, hey, this is really cool. And Theodore Reuss, who was kind of running the show at that time, said, hey, well, if you want to have OTO in England, I'll put you in charge of OTO, for the UK, basically. And so Crowley wrote his own versions of the initiation rituals, adding Thelema to it all. And so that was the first place where OTO changed, is when Crowley got involved. And it's generally believed that OTO is just existed mostly on paper. While Reuss may have run this Masonic groups, OTO itself didn't really start operating as OTO until Crowley wrote a new set of rituals and started putting people in England through them. And he wound up making some changes over the years. But what wound up happening is toward the end of his life, the only group that was really running, at least under him, was Agape Lodge in Southern California. And he's over in London, a world away. So OTO didn't exactly thrive as a body. And after Crowley died, his successor Karl Germer was, he didn't exactly encourage people to continue doing the initiations. And so what winds up happening is when Karl Germer dies, the surviving members of Agape Lodge realize this is an emergency, that this thing they've devoted their lives to was kind of withering on the vine. And Germer did not really leave a clear successor. And so there's this big question of what now? And so these surviving members of Agape Lodge decided, let's all get together and let's just restart this OTO thing. And that's what happened in the 1970s. And they, under Grady McMurtry, and they started doing initiations. And there's more members involved in the OTO today than there ever has been. And it's been this growing process, because restarting that group from just a handful of old members was a big job. And it's been a much like the individual Thelemite is trying to become the best version of themselves. And it just doesn't happen overnight. It takes some time. The same thing has been happening with OTO. And you kind of went from the crazy Wild West days, in the 70s, to things getting a little bit more organized and structured, and just as an organization, the members and the people have been trying to grow up, and it's just again getting better and better and closer to that ideal of what Crowley had in mind for OTO.
Yeah. Here's another question. That's after the Strange Angels series, the Agape Lodge returned to debate in our community. And what's your opinion about the lodge?
Oh, well, that's kind of complicated, because Strange Angel itself, it may be entertaining television, and I understand why, to make entertaining television, they had to do some of the things they did and change the things the way they did, but it is not accurate history. It's not accurate history of Agape Lodge, and it's not even accurate history of rocket science. They've written people out of the story, of the rocket science. They've added some guy, who didn't even exist to the magic side of things. And so the conversation about, Agape Lodge that came out of Strange Angel is very distorted. There's a book by Martin Starr called The Unknown God, which is a biography of William T. Smith, who was, again, just a lifelong Thelemite and supporter of Crowley. And through telling his life story, we also get the life story of Agape Lodge. And it's ultimately kind of a sad story, because, the members, like any of us, they were human, and they were flawed people, but you also but they were doing the best they could. They were sincerely trying to make this thing work. And then you got Crowley, who again sincerely wanted this thing to work, but he's there over in London trying to micromanage from a distance. And he was just hearing all this gossip and people being unhappy, and it was just a mess, but at the same time, if it was not for Agape Lodge, for the OTO as we know it today would not exist, because it was those members who were active in Crowley's lifetime who got back together again after Karl Germer died and said, we need to pull this back together again and get this rolling one more time. So whatever drama, sexual, politics and messy stuff, and Jack Parsons and W.T. Smith and apotheosis and all this other stuff. They were the spark that kept OTO alive to the present, that made it possible for OTO to be alive to the present day.
I have a question from Priscilla. He said that here in Brazil, we are now experiencing a satanic panic in a boom in the last 2-3 years. And United States, it was mostly the 80s. And if OTO and Telema took any attacks, and how was the satanic panic in relation to the OTO and Telema, in your opinion?
Oh, golly. I don't recall, and again, maybe this is just selective memory here, but I don't recall OTO really being a big target during the Satanic Panic. And I think that was because they were too concerned with rock and roll music, Dungeons and Dragons, preschools, one of the big cases, in the USA was this McMartin preschool case where somehow the people who ran like a daycare center for, preschool children were accused of running satanic rituals that these small children were participating in. And the whole thing was just preposterous, but these people's lives were ruined. They were bankrupt, they were social pariah because so many people believed this. And I think, what happens is when something like the Satanic Panic happens is that you can make ridiculous claims and people, and what these claims do is you kind of like jump over people's brains and you go straight to their heart, their emotions. And when people get upset, their brains kind of shut down and they're acting on emotion, not on reason. And I can recall, during the 80s and the early 90s, just these ridiculous claims, just saying that, oh yes, there are 50,000 people, a year that are, sacrificed. It's like, where are the bodies? There aren't that many missing people in the United States. And if you look at the FBI crime reports, and where are the bodies? Well, they have these portable crematoriums they carry around. It's like, it doesn't work that way. That's not how a crematorium works. You can't have this portable thing to burn bodies down to ash. It was just craziness. And every rock and roll band was secretly satanic. It was the stupidest stuff. I actually wound up delivering a paper to the American Psychological Association about how the Satanic Panic to me looked like a case of groupthink. And the word groupthink kind of means something different in mainstream society than it does in psychology. But in psychology, groupthink kind of is about this sort of dynamic where you kind of create almost like this cult-like thinking that you only involve people who agree with the leader. You discourage communication with people from the outside. You discourage contradictory opinions, and what winds up happening is when you have this real insulated group that only it's an echo chamber basically, and groups that are in that kind of an echo chamber tend to make disastrous decisions because they're removed from reality, they're removed from the facts. And they just have this crazy version of the truth that they tell themselves, which is not the truth. The famous example of groupthink is the Bay of Pigs fiasco from the 1960s. And to me, it was the same thing with the Satanic Panic. It was just people, it was this group of people who were all just talking to each other and had each other convinced, while reasonable people in the outside world were saying, this makes no sense. You therapists doing hypnosis, you're creating false memories. You're just making this worse. You're not finding the truth. You're covering it up, with falsehoods. So I'm very sad to hear that it's making a comeback, and I understand it's not just there in Brazil, but I understand from friends of mine over in the UK that there's rumblings of it happening there as well, and it's I don't know. It's like it feels like sometimes it feels like we haven't learned anything as a society.
In Brazil, we are all in the same pack. It's from Umbanda, from preachers, from people in spirituality, even Reiki practitioners. We are all Satanists, and
Yeah, exactly.
together. Even if you wear white and you praise Jesus like the Kardashians, the spiritualism, we are all Satanists.
Yeah, and I guess kind of coming back to the beginning, I think that's kind of why, at least in my memory, I don't really have a lot of recollection of OTO specifically being targeted for the satanic panic, because I think it's just because there were bigger targets. Yes. You know, there were sexier targets, more visible targets. You know, and if you could go after Ozzy Osbourne or or whatever, that was better, than this obscure group of this.
I have a question from Julio. He says, "What are your favorite parts of Aleister Crowley's life? Since you researched all his life and he's all full of big adventures, but what are your favorite parts?"
That's hard because there's just so many sides to him. But one of the things I think I come back to over and over again is just that he had a great sense of humor. And I think I kind of find that refreshing because, people oftentimes when they come to magic are very, very serious about this. And Crowley was this brilliant man and he was this prophet and blah, blah, blah. And that's all well and good. But at the same time, he was, he could be a real goofball. And I just kind of relate to that, I mean, I've got a sense of humor about my own spirituality, and I like to see that Crowley does as well. And so oftentimes, my favorite stories about Crowley are when he shows the sense of humor. This is the one that comes to mind right now immediately, is when he was suing Nina Hamnet for libel for saying that he practiced black magic. And so Crowley's testifying in court, and someone asks him, how can you be object to being called a black magician? Don't you call yourself the Great Beast 666? And his response is just like, well, that means nothing but sunlight. So if you don't like calling me the Great Beast, you can just call me Little Sunshine instead. And that kind of stuff is just, I don't know, that's hilarious to me. That just makes me love him even more. That when you see that side of him, and I mentioned them like editing the Sword of Song right now, and so much of that book is it's puns and sometimes they're serious magical puns, but they're puns or they're just social commentary, and there's just like one part of the book where he's got like a footnote, and then the footnote has a footnote, and that has a footnote, and another footnote, and another footnote, another footnote, and finally he says, the damn Don who was writing these footnotes was suddenly struck by lightning. And to me, when I saw that, that was like Monty Python in the Holy Grail, saying, and then suddenly the animator suffered a heart attack. It was just like, he was 50 years ahead of Monty Python. So, I mean, his magic and his writings are brilliant. I think I mentioned earlier, I think 8 Lectures in Yoga is just so lucid and clear. I like those sorts of things. His books. And Book of Thoth is, again, it's basically what he thought at the end of his life, what he put together, in many ways is his magnum opus. And so, again, while I have great respect for those things, it's when he's playful. I love the Book of Bonds. And again, some of that stuff is serious, and some of it's like, oh, what is, why is chapter 83 called The Blind Pig? And because, in English, pig, is spelled P-I-G, and numerically it's 80 plus 10 plus 3, which is 93. And so if you take out the I, the letter I, but it also means, the eyeball, Then you have a blind pig, and P and G by itself adds up to 83, and that's why it's chapter 83. And it's just, it's, I don't know. It's I like that he can be very serious, but he could also have fun with it at the same time. I think there's a lesson there for all of us.
I have another question here from Breno too. Is in the second decade of this century, what advice the new generations of Thelemites should learn from the first one?
Oh, well, I think I can think of a couple of things, and I think I'll start first just by saying something about OTO, even though Thelema is bigger than OTO. But I think I'd come back to what I said earlier, is that just as each of us is on that path to gradually and ultimately becoming the best version of ourselves, so is OTO. And OTO today is very, very different from OTO of 10, 20, 50, 100 years ago. And in that sense, I think it's important to keep pushing forward. And pushing forward also means, looking to the future. I think, and this isn't just OTO, I think a lot of people are interested in Crowley and his rituals and kind of preserving that. And there's value there. But when I look at Crowley's, like his recommended reading lists, for instance, his reading lists were what were cutting edge when in his time. Now they're 100 years old. And rather than reading 100-year-old books, and again, there's value in that because it helps us understand Crowley's mindset and where he was coming from, but we should also be studying what's the cutting edge today, and not just magic, but in religious studies and anthropology and science and philosophy and math. All of these things informed Crowley, and so I think there's that, and just kind of again getting away from this whole idea of OTO, but just Thelema in general, which is a much bigger umbrella. But the larger world of Thelema is still a pretty small world. There's not a ton of us out there compared to other groups, other philosophies, other religions. And I kind of feel like, I don't know, when I look on social media, it seems there's a lot of fighting and tearing down of each other. And I kind of feel like if we kind of turn our backs on or ostracize people because they're not in our club, that they differ maybe on some point of dogma or interpretation with you, or for whatever reason, if you keep doing that, ultimately you're going to wind up in a room all by yourself. And I think it's more important, because Thelema will just devour itself from within if we go down that path. I think it's better to build a community, across all those boundaries than to tear it down. And then saying that, I'm not saying that we should embrace or tolerate awful people in our communities. We do need to protect our community, but we need to nurture it as a community too, and rather than sowing division. Again, I guess I kind of think of the book of the law saying, "I'm divided for love's sake, for the chance of union." And and I think I'd like to see us working more on union and less on division.
We have been interviewing people from several different groups and studies and magical orders, and they are looking for the same things, that to become a better ourselves. So it has been great talking to you today, but that's the last question, the most important question, that is, how do we find you? How can we find your books? Rodrigo is saying he's throwing money at the screen, but
no.
Nothing is happening. So how can we find it? That you don't have your books in Portuguese yet. We were talking before this interview that we will do whatever we can to bring your books translated and published, even in Portuguese. But until then, how can we find you?
Well, again, for those of you who are English readers, Perdurabo is available. It's distributed worldwide, so you should be able to get that at your favorite bookstore. Same thing for the Wiser Concise Guide to Aleister Crowley. Panic in Detroit, which I mentioned, is available through Amazon, but again, you should be able to find that other places. Sword of Song, which is going to be coming out later this year, will be through Commuret Press in the UK. And I should mention that I hope I'm not going to get into trouble for saying this because it hasn't been formally announced yet, but I understand that a Spanish translation of Perdurabo will be coming out later this year. And so that will be, at least go something toward having something out there. And, I don't know, The Wiser Concise Guide to Aleister Crowley is a pretty short book. I mean, the idea was to put together a book that in 128 pages could kind of get somebody started. And that's something that might be a good candidate for a translation if there's somebody out there who wants to take that on. So, but yeah, but most of the books you can find at your local bookstore. And if you want to just see, again, the various books and book chapters and articles and things I've written, you can also go to my website, which is www.richard-kaczinsky.com. So it's just my name with a dash, richardkaczinsky.com. And you can also find me on Facebook and Twitter.
All right. It has been such a pleasure talking to you tonight.
I've enjoyed it too.
And I would just say goodbye to the people here, and then we open cameras and talk a little bit more with you.
Right.
But thank you so much for your time. It has been a great evening.
As well.
E para vocês que acabaram de assistir a gente, então não esquece, segue o canal. Os links que o Richard falou, eu coloquei aqui embaixo. Então vocês conseguem achar esses links aqui. Ok? Então segue o canal e a gente se vê aí no próximo bate-papo Mayhem.